So how does learning actually happen? How does learning actually happen? Well, there's a fantastic book, and it's written by Kirshner and Hendrick, and it's beautifully illustrated by Cavaliglioli. And I'm going to start off with that demonstration, but in this series, we're going to do a deep dive into how students actually learn so we can make sure we improve teaching and learning in the technical and vocational space. So check out this fantastic diagram, okay? And let me just kind of get rid of my initial coloring in here, right? So what we have is we have a situation where you've got an expert guy, and I'm going to do him in blue, and he's an expert chess player, and he's got a huge set of connections and understanding about all the different possible patterns and moves he can make when playing chess. And he's actually playing a whole bunch of novices. And the difference is that these novices only can work on individual moves at the same time. So he's able to come along and he's able to basically beat all of them and work far more quickly, because he's got a far more systematic and detailed knowledge set in his head to problem solve. And the thing which we're going to focus on in this session is that the way that you teach these guys over here, the novices, is completely different to the way you teach these guys over here, the experts. Okay, and we're going to take a look at a couple of key papers, and this book called How Learning Happens is a fantastic book to help us understand that, right? So now, the way that they structure the book is they start off by saying, let's get a basic rule. And the basic rule in teaching is that a novice is not a little expert. So you don't teach a novice, an early starter, the same way that you teach an expert. And the scientifically researched paper, which has proved this almost beyond doubt, is a fantastic paper called Categorization and Representation of Physics Problems by Experts and Novices. And they're going to show with good empirical detail, and I will take you through that paper in a separate video. Okay, and what's the quote? Well, not only do experts have more knowledge and they can work faster than beginners, they also tackle problems differently, right? And what we're going to do now is we're going to embed that properly. But they want to start off this explanation, and I'm talking about Kirshner and Hendrick here, who's summarizing the paper for us. They want to start off with a little story about homunculi, this term over here. And it's a bit strange that they want to start off a kind of introduction with the story about little people, but I think it really does carry it and give you an understanding of this key mistake teachers actually make. And they're talking about a guy a long time ago, 1537, a guy by the name of Paracelsus, right? And what he thought was the way you could make little people was what happened was you got a mini human created by nourishing a male sperm on human blood in a horse's room. And what would happen is a small version of the living human child would grow, right? So the idea is that the way birth happens and the way procreation happens is you've got a minuscule little image type of yourself kind of in the womb, and it grows. It's always a little person, and it grows. And the person who drew this is a guy by the name of Nicholas Hartsucker. And I'm going to show you the picture now that you can see. But his idea was that if you had to look into sperm, what would happen is you'd see right at the bottom with the microscope, you'd see a teeny human form, right? Okay, and here's a nice picture of it. Here's the sperm. And what you can see, unbelievably, they thought that in the sperm is a mini human being. Now, don't laugh, because actually what's going on over here is that we as teachers tend to assume that the way we teach a novice learner should be the same way that we teach an expert. We expect the novice to be like a smaller, littler version of the expert, and we try to use the same techniques. Techniques like problem solving, discovery learning, all these kinds of things which you get excited about as teachers work far better for experts than they do for novices, right? So here's the abstract to the article that they're working on. And what they say is the study investigates the differences, and they're working with physics problems and how they're represented on the one side by novices. I'm going to do novices in green all the time because you kind of, that's a symbol of being green and young, and experts blue because they love that color in terms of showing people who've got knowledge and all that kind of stuff. So what these guys did was a whole lot of different experiments. And some of the experiments were working with problem categories as a means of representation. And basically over there, what they're saying is they gave these guys a problem and they check what categories did novices and experts use to understand the issue. How did they represent it? And surprise, surprise, it was incredibly different. Then there were also category differences used by experts and novices. So in other words, they used different kinds of categories. And obviously there was a difference in their category knowledge. The experts knew more than the novices. And what happened was this translated into a situation where the aspects of the problems that form problem characterization and how they represented. So when they looked at the problem, when they looked at the aspects of the problem, they found that experts and novices looked at it differently. Right? And what they then did was they said, well, the results from these experiments suggest that experts and novices represent problems differently. And they do it in terms of the particular categorization of the problems and also the success in completing the problems. And it depends crucially on domain-specific knowledge. So the expert knows more than the novice. The experts use deep physics principles to categorize and solve the problems, whereas novices use superficial features. So when an expert looks at the problem, they say, what's going on underneath the surface? What deep problem does this represent? Whereas for the novice, they're kind of looking at the example itself and trying to work out what the example looks like and how they can work with that specific case. Right? So let's take a look at a little bit more of that. And you'll notice, by the way, that this book, this fantastic book, How Learning Happens, is laid out in such a way that they're doing this book for novices. And by me taking you through this book, I'm working with novice, right? I'm working with people who really need to be given an explanation for what's going on here. So if you're an expert, I apologize. This isn't for you, right? So how people categorize a problem depends on previous experiences with similar problems. And that shapes how they determine what the problem is and the quality of their solutions. Now, this has been well known for a while. Actually, a guy by the name of De Groot did here a PhD study, fantastic study, I've read it, on how chess masters interpret chess problems differently to novices. He found that they were completely different to beginners. What experts have is they have, and I'm going to do it in blue, they have more knowledge, they can work faster than beginners, and they also tackle the problems differently. What happens is they quickly recognize a particular chess position, and then they know what to do afterwards, the subsequent moves based on their prior experiences. Now, this is the same thing which happens with doctors. If they want to interpret the history, we call it anamnesis, which charts how a new patient is working with something. What they look for if they're a good doctor is they have similar clinical histories and charts that they've dealt with in the past, and they make their diagnosis based on their prior experience. So our prior knowledge determines the quality of our problem solving. Now, guys, if that's true, then an expert is really going to enjoy problem solving far more than a novice. Because if you don't know what the possible answers are and what the possible ways of exploring things are, you're going to feel like you're just bumbling around in the dark, and it's not going to be fun. The more novice you are, the more you're going to prefer someone actually initially showing you what the friggin' way of doing it is. And once you've mastered it and got it in your mind, well, then you can work with problems in a different way. Okay? And what we call that, if you've got qualitatively better knowledge, which is deeper, we call it deep conceptual knowledge, right? And that obviously gives the experts a head start. Now, the way this is described, and you'll see it before, is we say that experts have rich knowledge schemata. So now we've got that term, schemata, and what's going to happen is, because this is a coherent text where they're trying to work with novices, they're going to define it for you. And it's nicely defined over here. It comes from a guy by the name of Jean Piaget, and he's one of the most fantastic and most influential education researchers the world has ever known. He was exceptionally brilliant, right? He's a psychologist. And basically what happened was he started to realize that children are actually completely different to adults. They live in a completely different world and they go through stages of development, and your job as a teacher is to know that kids at different ages think and experience the world very differently, and you have to adjust your teaching depending on where they are. But he defined a cognitive schema as a cohesive, repeatable action sequence. You're not just thinking, it's something you can do, possessing component actions that are tightly interconnected and governed by a core meaning. And that's why you can see when these guys try to illustrate it, what they do is they kind of go, it's something which has got a whole lot of links combined, and these are combined in a structured and sequenced way, and it's coherent. You can use all of this as one thing, right? So that's the definition of a schema. Now the point is that if you have a good schema, well, then you can interpret the problem. But if you're a beginner, and let's do this in green, and you don't have this schema, you interpret problems by looking at the surface characteristics. You look at if there's a previous problem that dealt with a moving object, and you can see it's a moving object, well, then you go, has this got a moving object as well? So you're trying to look at the surface things, right? And because you're looking at the surface things, you might get confused about what's actually going on. Whereas an expert, and I'm going to highlight it in blue, they see the underlying concept to the problem. They're not looking at whether it's a surface character. They're using the surface characteristic to see what the deeper issue is that they're working with. And they can do that because they've got an extensive and qualitatively better schemata. And that helps them to do it. And this article, which is summarized in this book, and we're summarizing it now, this article by Chi, Feltovich, and Glaser basically shows how novice and expert characters in working with physics, and these were novices, first-year university students, in comparison to PhD candidates, right? And they saw that they were very, very different. So what did it show? Well, do students with a lot of prior knowledge categorize problems differently to students with little prior knowledge? Well, the answer to that is obviously yes, they do, right? But the trick you need to know is you can't just say in a general way yes. The question is, you as a teacher, how are you going to work with them differently? How are you going to understand that the way that they learn differently is key for you to teach them differently? Okay, so now what happened was they had a situation where the beginners categorized the problems based on characteristics in the description of the assignment. So if it was a picture of a block on an inclined plane, so if it looked something like this, you had an inclined plane and you had a block on it, and they were asking a question about some forces, well, then what you would do is you would identify it by the inclined plane and by the block, right? You wouldn't work as an expert who would go, hold on, what's going on here? This is a problem either of the law of conservation of energy, or it's got to do with more friction. They'd start to look at the deeper underlying physical laws and use that as a solution. And as soon as they identified this, the key thing is, and I'll do it in black here, as soon as they go, there's a conservation of energy, what that then means is that unlocks a situation in their brain where they're able to go, well, that means that we've got to work like this and like this and like this, and we've got to ask questions here. So it unlocks a set of techniques for them to use to answer the problem. Whereas the beginner is basically stuck just with trying to understand the problem as it is on the page. What prior knowledge is actually activated when people encounter a new problem? Well, what they try to look at is to see what prior knowledge did the beginners activate? Now, guys, on one level, it's obvious. The beginners don't have a lot of knowledge schemata with respect to the problem. So they're going to identify superficial problem characteristics, whilst the experts are going to see the physical laws and the circumstances to which they apply. So the key trick over here is you can't expect this beginner to happily work with the problem and understand what the possible solutions are. And you don't give them hours and hours to try and discover what the friggin' answer is. You initially build their schemata. You build it up so that when they've built this up, then you can go to answering problems and building with them. So you can see that that means you don't teach a novice in the same way that you teach an expert. Okay, and then another thing they asked, and this was really funny, and you'll see it when we do the actual paper in detail. The researchers asked the students to think aloud. Right, this was fantastic. It's really well done in the paper. And freely associate whilst reading the problem statements. So you'd hear in the recorded transcripts and the analysis what the beginner dude was thinking when he was trying to solve the problem, and what the experts, these PhD students, were thinking when they were trying to solve the problem. And what happened was the beginners, no surprise, they used the words in the problem, the actual thing itself. So if there was a word like friction, well, then they used it. If there's a word like gravity, they used it. Completely different to the experts who are immediately going, hold on, what are the status and conditions of the physical situation, and how do they go into a before and after situation, or are there external forces? They're immediately trying to get under the surface and look beyond the words that were describing it to the situation that they had. Right? Now, here's the next key thing. You're going to see that the experts are working in a very solution-oriented way. They're problem solving and they're enjoying it. Why? Because they've got prior knowledge, and that prior knowledge has got lots of procedural stuff. In other words, this step, this step, this step, that's procedural, right? Procedural is step, 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 step. So you know what to do it. And on top of that, they've got deep conceptual knowledge. And that gives them insight into the conditions under which the procedures can be applied. So they've got those steps over there, but they know the conditions under which it can be applied. So they identify the conditions, and then they know the steps they have to take to do the answer. So they love problem solving because they can work out where it is. Now your beginner is going to describe the physical characteristics of the various problems that is in that problem itself. They're not going to know what the link to the possible solutions is. So to put them in a discovery mode where you're trying to say, guys, try and work out what the answer is, please, and have fun. It's so exciting to do discovery learning. It's just going to be really crappy for these novices. Right? So here's a good summary of it. If you're working with a novice, they don't have access to the relevant schemata. They are attempting to remember and process individual elements. So that's the elements that they're going to work with. If you then, on top of that, give them problem solving, it's going to take up all their cognitive capacity to try and solve it. They're not even going to understand what they're doing. And they're going to work backwards. They're going to work from the problem, and then they're going to try and solve it backwards. They're going to go, well, the problem's like this. What does it mean if this means that and this means that? Okay, it could be that I've got to work it out like this. That's how they work. The expert, on the other hand, they do possess schemata for encoding elements into a single entity. And when they identify what that single entity is, right, so what happens is they go, okay, it's this and this and this and this. And then they go, oh, that actually means this. There's the broader or deeper law. So then they can go, actually, yeah, we have the parts that it's working on. And then this becomes a single entity. It becomes one thing. So in terms of their working memory, they're not working with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which they're trying to link. They're working in a situation where they're only working with one thing, which means they can combine it with another big thing, right? So they're working very differently in terms of how it works. Okay, they've got skill acquisition, and that skill acquisition is without needing to recall the rule. They already know how to do it. It's automated. They don't have to struggle to it. It comes automatically to them. They go, oh, okay, this is what the problem is. And crucially, they work forwards. From the problem, here's the problem. They go, okay, here's the problem. Then they go, okay, what are the possible solutions to the problems that we can find? So there we have it. So now what's the conclusion? Well, research that compares the prior knowledge of beginners, and bear in mind we're looking at research, guys. We're not doing like local anecdotal stuff. This is really worthwhile research that has stood the test of time. Shows that experts work very differently. And it's not only quantitative. In other words, it's not only that experts know more, but it's also qualitative. Their knowledge is organized differently. And that brings some implications. Number one, beginners are not empty barrels that have to be filled. In other words, you can't just fill them with information. You've got to work with the fact that they've got to make connections and build schemata. You've got to work on that. They're not small experts. Don't give them discovery learning and problems to solve initially. And when you teach, you should take that into account. So to do that, new knowledge must be related to knowledge that students have already acquired. And you've got to make sure that when you do it, you build their knowledge schema up. Now, you can look at the rest of the paper yourself, but that gives you the first core insight into how we do teaching and learning in the technical and vocational space, where we are trying to build people up to experts. And the rule is, don't treat a novice and an expert the same, and you teach them differently.